Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by EyePatchNotes. I hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about why some people might enjoy challenging the norm, whatever that is in games or indeed in life. There's a disclaimer from EyePatchNotes at the beginning of this Parley. The Pathfinder mechanics explained herein are composed of 70% white lies and 28% withheld information. An agenda with neutral good intentions is still an agenda. Indeed, thank you for the disclaimer. I actually have a disclaimer as well. This parlay features a long example that I'm not going to get hung up on the specifics. Reading this parlay, it doesn't sound to me like I agree with those distinctions, but you literally said at the very beginning of the parlay that it's made of 70% white lies and 28% withheld information. So I'm going to remind myself, and I want to remind the audience that the purpose of this example is to talk about what makes challenging the norm cool for some folks. And I'm going to spend the parlay focusing my energy on discussing that topic, not on nitpicking the examples you give, which, just to get it out of the way, I would actually. I don't, from what I understand, which you just said is 98% wrong. That doesn't seem like a distinction I would make or that I agree with. But it just doesn't matter. You were trying to talk about this multi-class character you made and why that's interesting to you, and I totally get that. So let's talk about that. Cool. Let's get started. As a direct sequel to June's suplexing parlay, the Rogue Barian was indeed born after considering the Holy Trinity in game theory. Revisions 1 through 3 of that were actually Fighter Barbarian, swapping Fighter for Rogue in revisions 4 through 6. And the goal was simple, diversifying and diverging from the mold. Lightning fast Holy Trinity speedrun, tank, healer, and damage dealers. The tank is optimizing to have more health and health worth more, therefore they can take the hits that other people can't at the expense of being able to do much damage or healing. The healer, at the expense of being a piece of wet tissue paper when hit and not doing much damage, is able to heal the tank enough that, combined with the fact that their health is kind of worth more because of their defensive stats, they can survive the boss's attacks, and then the damage dealers can optimize to just be a big old pile of damage with no utility or survivability because the tank and the healer exist. And games might be designed to kind of force you to do that to some extent, World of Warcraft, or they might be designed with a lighter form of that. You can kind of do this in Dungeons & Dragons, for example, but the game definitely isn't usually designed around that, by which I mean the official source books are generally not designed assuming you can do that. However, a point I will come back to later is that it is also less effective in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It isn't simply that players prefer not to do it in that game. The game says it is you gain less by doing this, right? As well as saying our encounters are not structured assuming you're doing this. But those are three different things that we'll get back to later. And so what was so cool to me in that previous parlay is I brought up how your suplexing barbarian, rogue barbarian, that throws enemies into your allies is kind of inventing a new defined role in the party, but you've done one that doesn't require the character to be lacking independence. They just do a thing that is a strictly defined role, and they can feel like a role player in the group, but they don't have to lose being able to do, a well-rounded set of things to gain that well-defined specific role. So I thought that was really cool. Anyway, keep going. One of the key differences between Pathfinder 1st edition and D&D 5th edition, to EyePatchNotes, is what an archetype represents. Most classes in D&D will ask the player to specialize at 2nd or 3rd level, resulting in most of a class's uniqueness. To omit an archetype is to drop below the expected level of power, leaving gaps in the class's progression table. While archetypes can vary wildly in quality, the rogue, the takeaway is that a D&D class is somewhat hollow in isolation. The class can only truly be elevated given player input. Pathfinder archetypes, by contrast, are strictly optional. Each class has a defined set of passive and active abilities regardless of player input. For example, the D&D fighter is known for its bonus feats, action surge, and fighting style, What a fighting style represents is nebulous, however, at times giving a bonus, at other times adding a new function. This is before fighter level 3, where you pick your subclass, and builds truly branch out. The Pathfinder fighter also enjoys bonus feats and then gets armor training and weapon training, but compared to D&D's fighting styles, armor training increases the maximum dexterity of a chosen armor type, I think you mean, while weapon training is a boost to damage and accuracy for a chosen weapon, or like a type of weapon, like swords or axes, or I think. A Pathfinder fighter is predictable and functional before any further assumptions. We'll get right back to that, because each Pathfinder class declares a set of named abilities. Archetypes can then refer to and remix them. The two-handed fighter does not gain armor training, and instead deals more damage when wielding two-handed weapons. When the fighter would gain weapon training, the benefits only apply to two-handed weapons. A player who takes the two-handed fighter archetype has declared that heavy armor with low dexterity is sufficient for their needs. Now, some of you might be saying, that doesn't seem like much of a difference. I think I understand what you're getting at. So the idea is that, and by the way, archetype, it might help some people if you say subclass instead, but same difference. In Dungeons & Dragons, maybe half of your character's features are from your subclass. The amount of stuff that is on your character sheet that is from your archetype or subclass in Pathfinder might not be as different, as much as it's just EyePatchNotes' point is that you're not lacking power level by not picking a subclass, because they tend to replace things rather than adding entirely new things. Now they do add entirely new things. Again, I said we weren't going to get too much into, like, I'm not entirely sure about this comparison point, but it doesn't really matter. The point EyePatchNotes is trying to make is that you don't need to add a subclass just to have like enough power level. In Dungeons & Dragons, more or less, you need to add complexity to add power in a way that you don't seem to in the same exact way in Pathfinder. That's interesting. That is a design. And having those kind of set, very quantifiable things in the archetype means that you can swap them out more easily. Now, I gather that when you said, so you get armor training, which increases the max dexterity of a chosen armor, easy for me to say. Armor training increases the maximum dexterity of a chosen armor by the same amount, like regardless of which armor it is. It's a set. You are getting a set dexterity increase, but just to what armor you're giving it is sort of the same, and so that's static. That would make sense. I don't know if that's how it works. Same thing with weapon training, right? You said it's a boost to damage and accuracy for a chosen weapon. For that to be meaningfully different from just like you pick a fighting style in D&D and it gives you a boost to damage or accuracy for a chosen weapon, it seems like the distinction would be that in Pathfinder it's like the same boost to damage and accuracy, but you just pick for which weapon it is. Whereas in D&D, a fighting style might give you some accuracy for certain range weapons or a benefit for two-handed or two-weapon fighting, but it's not the same benefit. That's the point, right? And so before the player makes those choices, you don't know what level of power the character gains. Whereas in Pathfinder, you do in a way you don't in Dungeons & Dragons. That's as much as we're diving into that, because I think that part is kind of relevant to what's coming. And what's coming is this. Given this framing, we can hopefully circle back around to the Rogue Barian multi-class that you made for that other parlay. At face value, something that Pathfinder actively relies on with like those terms that we talked about a minute ago. A Barbarian is a damage dealing and tanking class centered around its ability to rage. D&D's listed benefits for rage are accurate enough. While the Mad Dog Barbarian archetype takes away rage. By selecting Mad Dog, the player is opting into a rageless barbarian. So you can see up here we have the things that you say define barbarians, and then if you want to, you can pick this subclass or archetype, and you don't need to have an adequate level of power. It swaps some things out. It's not about you gaining more features, it's about you gaining different features that still feel thematically barbarian-y, I guess is the idea. So the main thing that I'm understanding is you lose rage, but you gain an animal companion, and you're going to gain the ability to companion them to command them as a bonus action. Action economy, EyePatchNotes continues, roughly what a character can accomplish in turn-based combat, is one of the major metrics to measure a character. Pathfinder has the daunting precedent that animal companions have their own class progression, feats, and actions. So what the Mad Dog Barbarian loses in personal offense and defense by sacrificing rage, the ability to rage, they make up for in double the amount of attacks they can make and HP to chew through will between them and their companion. This is also before flanking and other tactical plays, and Mad Dog Barbarian level 5 gains the ability to command their animal companion as a bonus action, Ferocious Fetch. Even though the companion moves and attacks on the Barbarian's turn, the companion will still get its full turn in combat. Sliding over to the rogue side of things, Sneak Attack is a fairly stat-agnostic way of dealing damage. Regardless of the underlying hit, the character will deal a predictable, and eventually sizable, quantity of dice. These sneak attack dice fill in a bit of the void left by rage while enjoying the rogue's other pieces of utility. However, I would go even further. As another daunting precedent, multiple Pathfinder archetypes can be taken from the same class. Oh, which is much more feasible because they don't give you more stuff, they just swap things out. Neat. Okay. The only limitation is that a class feature cannot be altered or replaced more than once. Right. Okay. Rogues in Pathfinder have Trap Finding and Trap Sense, two abilities that preempt or react to traps in the environment. Swashbuckler rogues give up these two abilities in exchange for martial training and daring. Because the rogue no longer has Trap Finding and Trap Sense, they're not eligible for archetypes that would ask for those abilities. Cool. In my heart of hearts, EyePatchNotes says, every Pathfinder class can always give up something. This is particularly true in the context of systematically assumed party size. Most of the campaigns published by Paizo, Pathfinder's parent company, are balanced around having 4 players. With the Holy Trinity in mind, I volunteer other party members as possible follow-ups to discussing kit-driven design. A Witch, derived from contradiction and mutual exclusivity, tank debuffer damage dealer. A Magus, to defy community consensus, debuffer damage dealer. Or an Oracle, to demonstrate greed and the barrier of knowledge, healer and something else. As well as this Barbarian that thrives despite not conforming, as a tank debuffer damage dealer. I'm a little lost on this. Are you saying that you want to discuss one of these and you're interested in my interest in discussing them? And I suppose these are, like, on their own, I can't understand anything about these, right? Like, there's not something I'm supposed to... I think I understand that I don't understand. You're just trying to say that because you can swap things out as much as you like, and the game kind of calls to that, they've made a real effort to create a game where you can always fiddle with more on a character without breaking their level of power, I guess. I don't know. I mean, so I want to talk first. There's like 3 different things on my mind. The first thing I want to talk about before coming back to that graphic is this idea of being able to swap things out constantly. So EyePatchNotes has told us that in Pathfinder, you can swap out elements of a class to gain various archetypes or subclasses, provided you have the things you need to swap out. So let's imagine that barbarians gain rage and the armor thing and the weapon thing. And then let's imagine that there are like 6 barbarian subtypes or archetypes, subclasses, whatever. And 2 of them replace each of those 3 things. So for example, there's 2 that replace rage and give you something else. There's 2 that replace armor thing and give you something else. And there's 2 that replace weapon thing and give you something else. So you can take up to 3 because you won't have the relevant ability left otherwise, right? However, there could be some, if I'm understanding correctly, where, for example, the one that does two-handed weapon fighting, that one you take the armor ability away, but you buff the weapon ability. So you have to have the weapon ability. If you took a subclass that already got rid of the weapon ability, you probably can't take that one, I would imagine. Or it just wouldn't do anything. Anyway. And so it seems to me like when you say they can always give up something, you must mean you don't have to leave them the way they are. There's nothing intrinsic about them. You can eliminate any part of the class and create something of your own. And so therefore each class is this kind of mutable thing that can be used to build a lot of different kinds of things rather than having set archetypes it's locked into. I what I wanted to start by saying is that I like the idea of that design because it keeps the character sheet full of things the player has said they care about rather than just a lot of things. But I'm not sure that the if the complexity was hand woven, hand waved, hand woven. That's interesting. I don't know if it's really as big of a difference. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, often there are many features of the class I had to take to get a subclass that is the actual relevant thing that don't really matter that much, but they're not being used in my build. But I just don't care about those things. Like, and I think that's true of a lot of players. Their build isn't filled with every single piece perfectly fits. Now I know about you already, though, EyePatchNotes, that you care about that, though. That's why I'm bringing this up. EyePatchNotes specifically, I think I feel comfortable claiming, to put the words in their mouth for once, really cares about each piece doing a thing, having it be clean, and there's no piece hanging off of the build that doesn't really do anything for the build is very appealing to them. So I understand how a design where you replace features instead of adding features, though it may make not much actual difference in practice, would feel way better, way better. And there are many advantages. Again, it's just cleaner for one thing. If that's not going to be the point of the build, then why does the player need to worry about it and keep track of it? I don't know. So that's cool. As a concept, that makes sense to me. Now remember, the purpose, as I insisted at the beginning of this parlay, the purpose of this example is to discuss the idea of what makes kind of challenging the norm cool. And I think one thing you can see here is authorship. What's one way to describe why it might feel good to change a class rather than simply adding the thing that is offered to that class. There's a bunch of subclasses, you can pick which one to add. This allows you to kind of change the class instead. Again, even though superficially it might seem like they're the same thing, there's this element of it being cleaner. You have much higher of a percentage of elements that are relevant to your build. And you kind of get to make it yourself a little bit, or tell your own narrative of what that archetype is going to do. They each have their own tools, and then you look at the list of things in the barbarian archetype and decide for yourself, well, which of those speaks to me, and then I'll remove the ones that don't to add more things that speak to me, rather than having it be that there are set visions and you pick which one to fit into. Now already you can see how certain different types of players would really prefer a game that has set visions that you fit yourself into, and other types of players that it has no value to them. I'm not going to project into any of your fantasies anyway, so you can make me make my own. It has no value to me that there's like a preset one. I understand that as a player. I just don't mind the resulting build being a little messy as much, or there being a ton of features that I'm not using. But I definitely personally get the appeal of a build system that doesn't insist on having things that are presented for you. You have to kind of figure out what. It's almost like you need to invent the classes yourself. They give you templates sort of for classes, and then kind of like how I said, maybe you could view subclasses as the actual classes in D&D. There have been previous D&D parlay where I went off about that. The classes it doesn't really matter in D&D, and so subclasses, just think of those as the actual classes, because they're often so different that it like isn't really appreciably the same. You could view it the same way here, that the archetypes that let you swap out features are kind of the real classes, but at the same time, there's something appreciable about the template you start from, which is what the game calls a class. You're starting from Barbarian, you have that set of things that are probably fairly unique to Barbarians, right? You would imagine. And then you swap out the ones you don't want. I definitely understand that. And the key thing, what I was trying to describe with authorship, is that it puts you in a position where once you've done this, you've created something that may be quite far from any of the existing classes. You might put yourself in a position where something I always think of is this thing I heard a player say one time. They said that they don't like people to know what like classes they are, like what combination of classes they are. And I think that they probably were thinking of things like this, right? You could see this character in play and possibly not know what, character archetypes they were. That would kind of go away. There's an immersive quality to feeling like, oh, this is just their specific unique character. They kind of invented a character archetype that didn't really exist before. Again, can you combine abilities to create something that didn't really feel like it existed before? Essentially in the same way in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Yeah, I think so. It doesn't seem like there's any meaningful distinction with that bit, but how you do that and what the overall package looks like, it's almost like an entirely new piece of game design that you make when you make a build, rather than just piecing together, which buckets of abilities can I combine in a way that is novel when you take it as a whole. I get that that could be different. Maybe people don't get that could be different. My sense that I've developed over the years that people mostly won't get that is going off, but I think I get it. Which I don't know if that matters that much. But what I wanted to get into a little bit more was the idea of earlier you said, the norm, in quotes, I noticed you did, but you didn't define what you meant by the norm, but also by the quotes. And I mean something by that, so I want to talk about that. Looking at the multi-class that you've made, and having talked about it for a few parlay now, it seems good. Like in if the game is anything like D&D, yoinking an enemy into a group and you also have multiple bodies on the board. You mentioned flanking briefly, a huge understatement, right? That would be absurdly powerful with flanking. You would put a situation in front of your party where you can likely fully surround most enemies, which with Pathfinders and D&D's similar combat mechanics, they're screwed. Like they're dead. You gain an enormous advantage, even if they had the same number of actions as you. You gain a huge, ludicrous advantage flanking to hit them much more frequently. They're going to have a lot of difficulty getting away if for any reason they need to get away from you. If they want to be in melee range of you, maybe just don't do this. But if they probably do want to get away from you a lot of the time. So they're an enemy spellcaster. Like they're mincemeat the moment you do this. So it seems good. I haven't gone through, and you didn't mention much in this parlay, so I won't focus on it too much because I've got other stuff to say. The sanctified archetype rogue. But note here that EyePatchNotes gives us an example of where they've combined multiple archetypes, right? They swapped out multiple of the rogue core features to make something that is a sanctified swashbuckler rogue and a mad dog barbarian, making enough modifications that this is beginning to feel like it isn't an existing character option. It's almost like this is a new thing. The exact list of things that are available at once is approaching a level of novelty that just doesn't overlap enough with rogue or barbarian to really feel like this character is a rogue or a barbarian, which could be quite exciting to some people. Could be a lot of fun, but I wanted to stress that it is also effective, because I want to highlight the big, I think, difference between what is the norm because it appeals to players, like the average humans playing the game, and what is the norm because the game rewards it. And there's kind of a third thing, which is what the game is designed, what the encounters in the game are designed around, which is kind of complicated for tabletop role-playing games, so we're not gonna worry about that one. But here's what I'm getting at. Let me give you an example. So just by virtue of this being complicated, I mean, maybe not too complicated, but you've made quite a few choices with the build. You would expect it not to be as popular. It just isn't as, you could use the term obvious, I guess, right? And we haven't made any comment yet about whether it's good. People have this implicit thing they do where they act like if something is popular, it's got to be for substantiated reasons, right? No, not really. Like everybody can be wrong. That's possible. Now, being realistic, it's probably good, the thing that a lot of people do. What frustrates me is just that people make the mental leap and then kind of won't catch themselves making the mental leap. That the popular thing that is good is obviously not the only thing. It will probably only be a very, very, very small number of things. After all, if you want something that just works available, and there is something that just works available, well, you'll simply use it. No need to have another thing that just works available, right? There might be a few options, just to cover a player's common objections. Maybe a player doesn't want to play a melee character, and so there's probably a well-known ranged damage dealer, as well as a well-known melee damage dealer. You get what I'm trying to say. And then there'll be, people will maximize basic things. There'll be a common character that maximizes tankiness, and a common character that maximizes damage, and a common character that maximizes kind of both. Like they're trying to just get the most raw power on the build, power budget, I guess, on the build. But beyond that, you wouldn't expect there to be more. And it would be the simpler ones you would expect that would work really well. Or if there's a moment of complexity, it's going to be some extremely powerful single interaction. And that is going to be popular simply because it is easy to understand and applies to a lot of people, which is the definition of popular. That a game will have things like this that are good is almost taken as a given by the fact that the game has been designed for a large audience. There will be things in the game that are viable options that are not extremely difficult to uncover. You see what I mean? Making a game where you must make this or this level of complexity, medium though it may be, to play the game effectively is not commercially viable. Just sort of end of discussion on like why the community isn't going to, find something different interesting. And so following what the common player of a game finds interesting is going to get stale quickly in a way that doesn't really have anything to do with any individual person's love of novelty or experimentation yet. That's just something you would expect to get old. Now, I think ideally, in a well-designed game, you can just play any of the other archetypes kind of at its face without multiclassing, without, doing anything crazy to it. And that will be an interesting breath of fresh air that is still very viable. In other words, the players might fixate on, let's say, fighter, wizard, and paladin. But if they had instead fixated on sorcerer, that wouldn't be far behind in usability or like reasonable complexity. That is, most of the archetypes in the game are hopefully pretty similar in those stats. It doesn't mean the community won't fixate on a few. And indeed, you can expect they probably are fairly similar in most of those stats. They're probably not massively different in their effectiveness, though sometimes there's an outlier that's just kind of weird. Really, I think it's more like that. There's one or two that are maybe kind of bad, rather than one or two that are stand out way better than everything else. That, I think, is the more common experience in these games, but I don't know. The point I'm trying to make is that there's a big difference between the things that the players have decided are effective. They just don't know 95% of possible things, right? And so what they decide is effective means very little. It just means that is the obvious thing, basically. Or that's the easiest way to be enough effective, that most people, won't worry about it anymore or whatever. There's a big difference between that, which I would argue just kind of gets boring for everybody at some point, and being interested in something that isn't effective in the game. It seems to me like what you've made, EyePatchNotes, is something that is very clearly like the norm in any appreciable way in Pathfinder. in that you've used Pathfinder systems to make something the game rewards. It just isn't the norm in the community, which says really nothing about Pathfinder. That's just like anything with, I see some choices here, so it must not be the norm in the community. That's kind of an oversimplification, but that's sort of my thought. I think this distinction is meaningful. I think that people who want something different, refreshing, often, in my experience anyway, talk past people who want something that I'm going to say is different in more of a way of being a meme. They want something that doesn't care about what the game says is effective. Whereas it seems to me like EyePatchNotes only wants something that doesn't care about what the players say is effective. And the simple explanation I would give is that the players are literally just wrong, whereas the game kind of can't be wrong in a certain sense. The game, correctly understood, does and doesn't reward certain things. Or your DM does and doesn't reward certain things. Your game master is, going to screw your build over or not. But to me, those things are quite different. I would interrogate the idea that what we are discussing here actually is challenging the norm as much as just not doing the obvious community thing, which is sort of could almost be assumed. You could almost just assume where anybody who's going to bother sitting down to talk about this for a half hour probably isn't going to then talk about one of those things. By the time they get to the point where they've written down their parlay and paid $9 for a parlay video, they would already have grown bored of one of those archetypes, or they would have something very interesting to say about it, I would imagine. For a simple example, there are some very obvious archetypes, like in Nova Drift, there's this build where you make a ton of copies of your primary weapon that are fired by drones, allied drones. And it's pretty elementary as a playstyle, fairly obvious to do, something a lot of people who've played the game have probably done. But I just think it's pretty fun. Like, I think it has a unique aesthetic that bears some discussion. It almost has like a really interesting gameplay experience for the player that feels curated, even though I feel like it sort of wasn't on the surface, or like it feels like a sort of a new basic way to play the game. The user experience of playing that build where you shoot for you. You don't have to hold down the trigger and fire your weapon. I don't know why I can't explain that incredibly basic thing. They shoot your weapon for you. You don't have to fire. They just shoot it automatically in front of you, and you just aim it by turning your ship. You don't pull the trigger. Has a quality of life feel that I feel like goes beyond a specific build. That to me almost feels like the base game a little bit more. And so while that build is boring, I think like I would be interested in talking more about that build, because it doesn't. I actually did make a video about that build, because there's something interesting about how it feels. You might say, in this game, there's this basic class, but the way it plays is actually pretty wild. Like, there's something very weird or special about that basic character class. I'm not saying that discussing the basics in a game with interesting build options available is like bad or stupid or not worthy of discussion. Just to say that I feel like there almost is no norm. That's sort of my shtick with this parlay. As EyePatchNotes has explained at considerable length, these mechanics are essentially the basics in Pathfinder. The fact that the community doesn't use these things as much as you are, to me, doesn't really say anything about, I don't know, like what makes challenging the norm cool is that there isn't anything else that is cool. I don't know. There's nothing else. The norm, it could just be viewed as like the baseline. The game doesn't say, you need to combine these options. And so, yeah, that's not that interesting because you haven't played the game yet. But playing the game at all, and therefore using those options to some extent, I don't know. I and we've talked about this a lot before, but whenever these topics come up about wanting to do something different for the sake of it being different, I always prickle, and I'm trying to interrogate why. I'm interrogating why because I feel like it actually is just the normal thing. Like, it's not that or I almost want to say some, it's not some folks, everybody feels this way, and they just have different perspectives along the path to wanting to make this. I'm a fan of this graphic, by the way. Um, and that's why, not so much that some people want to do a completely different thing, except when they do. That was my point about, there will be people who, when they want to do something that's like, not just the meta thing everyone is doing, sometimes they mean it's not the obvious things the community is doing, it's another clearly very good thing that I made up over here. But other times they mean I want to make something that is different but has no other merits, like isn't good or usable in gameplay. It just is a, technically you could pick this combination of options, and that is a very different thing. And I think it's that gets it tangled up. People talking about this subject this way makes it sound like it's more of a stance than it is I guess how I feel. When in fact I feel like essentially everybody who plays the game for any meaningful amount of time and isn't immediately satisfied with the thing that comes up here will go on to do like use the systems in the game to make something different. But then there's a fork where some people actually don't really care about being effective in gameplay. And I think that is the thing to draw the distinction between. I'm trying to reword this in a way that demonstrates my understanding. The what makes like trying to find new ways to be effective fun to a lot of people, or why doing novel things that are actually good is appealing to a lot of people. Why are people interested in novelty that is actually effective in gameplay? Why isn't novelty good enough? You could view it that way. I'm heavily biased against the meme build thing because you can hear it in the way I've been describing it. I think it's just meaningless. Like you could just pick any combination of things and there's no metric for how the combination is. So there's nothing to evaluate. You could, like, sure, you can combine those things that way. That's fine. I think it is going to wear off quick, the novelty of having a nonsensical combination of elements that doesn't really do anything, because it just doesn't do anything. You're not really playing the game, I would argue. A lot of people find that really fun in a way I insist is ultimately without depth. There just isn't really a way to continue enjoying that after the initial haha of that thing existing. And that's why I've traditionally not been very interested in those things, or they're just very infrequently brought up when we discuss builds. I've noticed over the years, as the way that we discuss things has become more structured, I very, very rarely are those things brought to my attention because there's just nothing to say about them. And so if the premise in the community is, we're going to discuss this build, well, you kind of can't discuss a lot of those things. Again, there could be kind of a separate appeal of doing a case study of why it isn't good, or like doesn't do anything. It's not that it isn't good that really matters necessarily. But what I thought this parlay was going to be about, to conclude, is I thought you were going to go into the whole thing about how having there be some basic level of effectiveness that the game asks for is like a fun, like a tennis net, or anyway, in sports, guidelines of some kind on the field that mean you need to do something kind of specific. There is some bar for a thing being like a reasonable choice to make. You can't just choose anything anywhere, for that would make it meaningless to make those choices. It is no different from picking randomly. Though that could be fun if such a game existed and all those things were very effective. But the appeal of making a build is that there are merits to certain options over others, and you need a certain level of effectiveness. And so you have to figure out a combination of options that you enjoy that still is playable, I guess. That might not be the appeal of making a build to everyone. But just to say that if it isn't that, I think the appeal of a game where every single combination is equally enough useful. Literally every single combination, right? Not lots of different combinations. Literally all combinations are equally useful. wouldn't really have a lot of the feelings of making a build because you wouldn't really have opportunity cost in an unusual way. You would have a limited number of choices, but they simply don't gain or lose you enough for it to matter in this theoretical game where all the options are basically equal, yet they're apparently meaningfully different. That seems very difficult to make. And again, I think a lot of people, when I say that, you might be thinking of a game which I bet that we can resolve the confusion by that game being defined as having a lot, many very good options. But there are still if you really go looking, there are still lots that are really bad, right? You ultimately do need to make intentional choices that give you effectiveness if you want to clear the game's content. And so that creates a kind of limit or net where you can't just make any decisions. And so you try to make interesting decisions with limitations, which breed creativity. I don't know. I decided to do that I remember looking at the clock and thinking, I think I am going to bring that topic up because it fascinates me. It's something that I have trouble understanding, if you can't tell. And I always read things like this and relate to everything except the idea that that's like something out of the ordinary. Just because a lot of people don't necessarily do it, I don't think it's something that is different about people as much as just the raw amount of time or interest the person has in the thing. I am going to hot take that there aren't people who don't like doing this provided they're interested enough in the game involved. I think what's true is that a lot of people simply don't have the time or mental energy to get to the point where they'd want to do this. Whereas if they do, I think it's only a matter of time, or there might be something keeping them from enjoying it. It's not that some people magically don't get bored of making no decisions in the game forever. I don't. I reject the idea that that is a thing. Just as a not permanently. My mind could be changed, but yeah. And so I always have trouble relating to the challenging the norm part because to me it doesn't really feel like challenging that. That's just sort of like, of course, there will be like no real meaningful nuance to the surface level thing the community is doing. But that's irrelevant. Like, that's just like saying there aren't any pre-made builds inside of the game's instruction manual. It's like I mostly wouldn't expect there to be, or the pre-made builds inside of the game's instruction manual are boring. It's like, yes, so that you can come up with the interesting ones yourself. I don't know. Maybe this doesn't mean anything. EyePatchNotes, I hope you were surprised in a positive way by what I had to say about this subject. I thought it was a pretty useful example, all in all. Going into a good amount of detail about the mechanics wasn't as helpful in the beginning, but came back around to be very useful. So I'm glad you included that at the end, even though, again, you could do a whole separate parlay very easily. I will if you want. That is about the game design change made by having it be that you swap out aspects of a class. I kind of got into that a little bit, but tried to contain it a little. A quick little shout out as well to a little sidebar that you wrote and explained you thought was kind of too detaily or verbose for the main parlay. Indeed, this is longer, almost as long as the main parlay. But I wanted to quickly highlight it. It was a little anecdote that you had about a game that you played, Aura Kingdom. Aura Kingdom. That's a very... I know what year that game was made by the name. You know what I mean? Yeah, that sounded cool. You talked a little bit about how every class having a particular stat they scale with would mean that some classes would match up in a way that might seem unintuitive if you're familiar with that sort of trope for the class. And I wanted to read one specific bit about it because I wanted to discuss the topic of things being obvious. I feel like this is, depending on your opinion, either should have been the focus of the entire parlay or is a minor footnote. So I'm going to deal with that by discussing it briefly here. Let me explain. So first of all, EyePatchNotes says, so there's a combination in this game, Guardian Sorcerer, in this game, Aura Kingdom. Guardians, which are classic melee tanks, Scale with defense. Sorcerers are a debuffing and range support type of class. Scale with HP. So you can see where this is going. You said combining the properties of these two classes makes sense on paper, yet this nuance is not acknowledged by the developers. Instead, Guardian is paired with true offense classes, and Sorcerer with other ranged offensive classes. But you say a guildmate used to run this combination. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, I don't know what you mean by not acknowledged by the developers. Where this topic begins is it's cool, but seems like it would be obvious. That's where this topic starts. That if there's a class which has one strength and scales with defense, and another class scales with HP, a stat that has multiplicative benefits with the other stat, then they would have synergy. You know, the two main stats you build make each other better, yet you don't have to play two things that have a lot of overlapping abilities to get two stats as your main stats, which overlap their effectiveness. That seems obvious. That seems like people who play that game would think it would pretty easily be able to come up with. Like, that's pretty obviously good. So when you say not acknowledged by the developers, Guardian is paired with true offense classes and Sorcerer with other ranged offensive classes, maybe you mean the gear in the game, or the I don't know, like the something in the game sort of assumes you're going to pair things certain ways. So the topic of obviousness. Well, there's obviousness in the community. You know, something I've run into a lot is that I'll make a video. I've in the past made a few videos where there were some comments where people said, I can't believe you made such a meta build. Like, I hate the meta and I want things that are only not in the meta. And what always frustrated me about that is that they're not really saying anything about the build itself. They're just saying, I know about this already. And so therefore I've made the mental leap that everybody knows about this already. So it's objectively a low complexity topic, when what's true is just that they already know about it already. It's irrelevant that they already know about it already. What would be interesting would be if somebody were to say, like, this is just very obvious. Like, the game basically tells you to build X, Y, and Z. And in some cases, I even said in the video, you know, this is a pretty basic way to build, I don't know, Rhino in Warframe. But I think it's interesting how you can fiddle around with and optimize, you know, even that very basic thing. And the premise of the video is on digging deeper into that basic thing rather than saying, hey, did you know this exists? No, I assume you do know this exists, right? But you can see how it gets hairy when people bring the topic of what is considered obvious by the community into play. Nearly every time I have heard that brought up by myself, I'm guilty of it too, or other people, it would have been better to not say it. It was usually an empty comment that only said something about what that person was familiar with. And it would have been better to say, maybe, like, for example, as a side note, you could say, like, it may interest you to know that a good amount of the community has or hasn't noticed this as well. I wonder why that is, you know, something like that. For example, I remember noticing that Kokomi in Genshin Impact, when she came out, Kokomi was the character that she's got a passive that basically makes her not scale with crit. For the sake of time, I'm just going to simplify it that way. And most characters in Genshin Impact at the time were being built to scale their damage using, you know, damage percentage, attack percentage, and crits pretty heavily. So on the surface, very, very surface level, it seemed like that character didn't have one of the three multipliers everybody else had, right? But if you simply read the rest of her kit, it seems like she's being given healing percentage as a way to kind of make up for that. She scales her damage with that in a certain way that's unique to her. And so it's probably fine. You would then predict, well, this probably will be a slightly less popular character at first. And she was. And then they released a gear set that kind of uniquely enabled her. And then you would kind of predict that she would jump in popularity, which she did. And so to say, you know, people have a tendency to say, well, because this isn't a thing I've seen as often, you therefore bear the burden of proving that it's effective, right? When actually much of the time, I would suggest that the thing that's popular bears the burden of proving that it's effective, because it usually doesn't come with reasoning. If I show you something you haven't seen before, but I explain why it works and then show you that it works, that should be easier to accept than seeing something that you've heard of many times, but it hasn't been explained to you why it works well, and you haven't seen it work well. However, most people do the opposite. Most people almost immediately accept the thing that a lot of people say is good, even if they have no reason to believe it works well, like they don't know why it would work, and they also haven't actually done it or seen it work well. And then you'll show them something that you can literally see it does work, and you can explain why it works, but they will reject that because it's not broadly considered to work. It's almost like people feel like there's some kind of trick, like you're trying to fool them or something, which isn't generally possible in these games. But that that is also kind of an elephant in the room for this subject. The idea of something being obvious or a well understood option, sort of manipulating, I don't know, people just don't, magic thinking, etc., etc. But it caught my eye, this example that you gave. I would be interested to hear more about this potentially. The idea that these two classes, which seem to have different strengths that could be complementary and they do very different things, but they have this benefit where they scale with stats that complement each other. That seems like something I would expect most players to notice and use. It's somewhat odd to me, the idea that even the developer like wouldn't, I don't know that. Um, that just seems weird. Or even the thing you said about your guildmate used to do this, and damage over time effects that the sorcerer had generate more aggro to like draw fire as a tank, so that benefits the guardian part. Like that's something that in a lot of Holy Trinity games I've played, that mechanic came up, and so it's hard for me to believe that a lot of people playing that game like totally had no idea that that was a thing. I believe you. It's not a problem with that. I'm just saying that I'm trying to highlight a key thing about obviousness and the perception of obviousness. Am I wicked biased from my experience playing games, and that's why I feel like, wait, no, there's no way people wouldn't know that? Or, it's obvious because you've laid it out. Well, we already know because you've told us, and so sure, it's obvious now, and who knows how we'd feel in the moment, right? Um, I don't know. I really don't know. It would be really interesting to create. You could imagine a game that created like an obviousness simulation, where the mechanics are different in some meaningful way for each player, so you can't check what other people have come up with, and then we get to compare. Who's, did you think to connect these mechanics this way, in this more obvious way? Maybe I could try each meta and say, oh, it seems like that one, this combination is good, and then you could see what the player came up with. You could oppose people in the metagame. That could be cool. Both players get a set of game mechanics that are somewhat randomly generated. They get to play the game for an hour, like extremely hyper speedrunning and MMORPG. And then they both play the end game and see how they compare to each other and who came up with like the better, tiny, tiny, tiny microcosm meta in the game. And I think it would be fascinating to see what does and doesn't feel obvious, or what different players do and don't think to do. Playing Arknights has also finally made me think about this a lot. When I deploy a unit in a certain spot in this tower defense game, you could do this with any tower defense game. I often think to myself, did most people put a unit there? Is that feels like an obvious place to put a unit because there's many clearly explainable benefits or whatever, or is there some location that surprisingly a lot of people thought of, but which didn't even occur to me, like something like that? And in that type of game, you could quite easily show people. That's what kind of breaks me, right? You could sort of know, okay, now that was your extra. You all waited a long time for Parley, right? So that was your extra half hour of conspiracy theorizing about what is the norm. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was okay. I hope I still covered the topic in a way you were interested in. If I didn't, let me know. And thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for your support in Parley. Looking forward to doing the rest.